Thank you for joining us today. And leading our time together will be Brian Purdes and Josh Rothman. A little bit about these two gentlemen. Solutions Principal Brian Purdes joined PointClear Solutions in 2015, and he has more than 20 years of experience in technology. Brian offers expertise in agile development methodologies, solution strategy and design, enterprise software development, web development, information architecture, business intelligence, and business process re-engineering, and program and project management. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Alabama. Josh Rothman is a UX design principal based out of PointClear Solutions' Nashville office. He leads a team of design experts where he drives UX strategy, creativity, and client management. Josh also collaborates with PointClear's other design principals to push the boundaries of user experience industry standards. Prior to joining PointClear, Josh was the senior manager of UX at MedHost. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Management Information Systems from Tennessee Technological University. With that said, welcome Brian and Josh.
Thank you, Kevin. We really appreciate this opportunity to share with everybody today. We hope this presentation provides everyone some food for thought that they can apply on their projects and hopefully increase the opportunity for success. So before we get started, let's talk through a couple of reasons why software planning and good design is so important. There's some studies that we've been looking into and have been out for years that really talk about how successful are projects that are using technology. Forrester Research found that of technology projects, 70% of them fail due to a lack of user acceptance. So even if you're creating the best product possible, if you're not creating something that is meeting your customer's needs, then your likelihood of success is extremely small. Several other studies are out there that talk about the fact that 15% of all IT projects are abandoned, with 50% of development time many times lost or thrown away because you're developing applications that people aren't using or features that people aren't using. And those particular types of issues could have come up through good usability practices. And then lastly, PMI has identified that 47% of unmet project goals are generally due to poor requirements management. So while these numbers may want to make you run away from your next technology projects, we're going to be covering a few key strategies today that will hopefully increase your opportunities for success. We've got a lot to cover, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. One of the first strategies you can consider is defining measurable goals and objectives. This will really help you provide a firm foundation as you move forward and let you build on that over the course of the project. Galileo once said that measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so. This is really key. It's extremely hard to determine if you're successful if you don't have something to measure that success against. We found that there's a couple of different strategies that you can use in order to start off on the right foot. And one of the key ones is to take the SMART goal approach. So a SMART goal is defining a goal that is very specific. Of what are you trying to focus in on? Don't be vague. Vague goals provide vague solutions. Make sure that it's measurable. It's hard to quantify. If you can't quantify something, it's very hard to show that you're making progress. Ensure that it's achievable. It's completely okay that if you have short-term and long-term goals, but as you're defining especially those short-term goals, make sure that it's something that can be achieved. Those longer-term goals, maybe not as important, but the shorter-term goals, the product goals, the things that you're aiming for, make sure that those are achievable. And kind of an extension of that is make sure that they're realistic. So based upon the current resources that you have or the resources that you're anticipating having, that you can accomplish those goals. And then lastly, make sure that it's time-oriented. Set some boundaries around it so that you can begin that planning process. One key thing to think about, SMART goals has been around for a long time. It really hasn't changed with the implementation of Agile methodologies. It's really not any different. It's extremely important to start off on the right foot and to define those goals up front. So let's talk through a couple of bad examples of goals. So here's just a couple that you may have used yourself or that you may have heard many times before. Now, these are just great, just goals in general. They're just not SMART goals. So, for instance, you may have heard, I want a better website, or I need a mobile application that's much cooler than my competition, and I need it ASAP. Or I need a streamlined business process that increases my revenue. Or the last one here, and this is more from a personal basis, I'm going to get in shape. Well, those are great goals in general. They're just not SMART goals. If I say I'm going to get in shape, but I never go to the gym, I never start walking or exercising, then it's just a goal. There's nothing specific, and it's really hard to start planning that out. So since we talked about some bad examples, let's talk about some good examples. So there's a couple here that we want to talk through. So for instance, increasing the sales of our product by 25% within 6 months, reducing medical errors within the OR by 25% by January through education and policy changes. We're decreasing patient wait times by a percentage through the implementation of telehealth solutions by the first quarter. And this last example here, increasing conversion rates of our site, for instance, by September 2018 through a streamlined billing process. So as you notice, the difference between these previous just plain goals and SMART goals is that these goals are specific, measurable, realistic, and time-oriented. Now that we've looked at these goals and we've determined, how do we structure those goals in a way that are measurable, things that we can then measure ourselves against, we need to put those goals into action. And there's a couple of just key things to remember when you're doing that. One is to keep goals to a minimum. You don't want a list of 100 different goals out there. It's very hard to communicate that to the team. It's hard to measure. It's hard to track. So try to keep those to a minimum. Also, always take a look at those goals and periodically revisit them. If your company has pivoted and shifted its focus, reevaluate those goals. If you continue to develop a solution that's based on old goals, then you're not hitting your targets. You're not aiming for the right thing. And then lastly, utilize some tools such as impact mapping, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and other tools to really branch out from there. The important thing is to not start with features and come up with goals. It's to start with goals and then determine the strategies for implementing those. So one of the things to consider is these are your goals. They're not necessarily your customer's goals. So to better understand your customer needs, you really need to understand their entire journey. So to provide a couple of best practices to better understand that journey, I'll be turning things over to Josh Rothman to walk through a couple of strategies that you can apply to better understand your customer.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So as Brian said, to help get the design off the ground, we're going to walk you through how to understand the customer's entire journey. So to look at the quote we have over here, never answer an anonymous letter from Yogi Berra. I'm not sure that applies to what we're talking about here, but I love Yogi Berra quote, so I wanted to add that in here. So the journey doesn't start at the login screen. So what that means is there's a lot of homework that needs to be done beforehand, before you start designing that login screen. There's a lot of factors that go into what your user's needs and wants are. So you want to learn about the user's motives and goals and behaviors and tasks and time and health and environment and struggles, to name a few. Why does your users want to use your software? Why do they need to use your software? To give a couple of examples, let's talk about health. If your users are patients in poor health or they're elderly, that might influence the typography. That might influence the interactive controls that you're using. Talking about environment. Are your users in a well-lit, bright room? Are your users in a dark operating room with a spotlight? That might influence if you choose a dark theme or a light theme for your design. So how can we learn these items that we just talked about? Who is on this journey with you? A good approach, a good exercise to do here is create personas. And this is where you and your stakeholders or your subject matter experts can get in a room together and define who the actors are. Create personas or profiles. Give them real names. Make them personal. Learn what their goals are, their behaviors are, their challenges are, their needs are. And then revisit this, often. When you come to a crossroads, 3 weeks down the road, make sure that you're going back and you're making sure that your designs are meeting their needs and their behaviors and their challenges. Another exercise to do is actually create a journey map. Define where the road starts and it ends. This is going to help you and your customers speak the same language. It's going to help uncover the uncertain or the unknown. What you want to do here is define start to finish. Again, as we talked about earlier, the journey doesn't start at the login screen. How did the user get there? What are they feeling? Define those phases. Define those steps. Point out what the actors are doing, what they're feeling, what they're needing. Another thing is creating an application map. Finding the right path. This is going to help determine which screens need to be designed. You don't want to just go ahead and start on that login screen. Map it out. A good designer designs screens. A great designer designs workflows. So map that out in an application map. So since we've kind of talked about a little about the high-level exercises that you can do, let's dive in a little bit deeper and talk about the focus. So the quote here: what is the problem you're trying to solve? And I'm not sure I can coin that phrase, but I say it enough that Brian wanted to put my name under it, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So number one, your buyers aren't always your users. A good example here is think about dog food. The buyer and the consumer are completely different. At least I hope so. So you want to understand your users. We can create personas, and we can talk to stakeholders, and we can talk to subject matter experts, but nothing compares to actually talking to users. And some options, and these are just a list of few. You can send out surveys. You can create focus groups. You can do user interviews. You can do demos. And demos doesn't have to be the build itself. You can do demos on concepts or ideas or wireframes. Next is understand the difference between problems and solutions. Here's some examples of what are not problems. We need a new report. I want more color. Let's add sliders. Make it more intuitive. Once you get to this point and you've talked to users, you've talked to stakeholders, it's important to decipher again what are problems, what are solutions. To give you an example, take for instance, I want more color. Well, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Wanting more color is a solution, but until I can understand what the actual problem is, I can't come up with a good solution. So when you talk to these users or talk to these stakeholders and they say, I want more color, what does that mean? Are the screens that you've shown them, are they giving the users a headache? Are they having trouble, reading text? Is it difficult distinguishing between, what's important and what's not? Once you understand that problem, then you can come up with the best solution. The solution might be to add more color. It also might be to remove color. It might be to add icons. So there's a lot of different solutions that you can come up with once you understand the problem itself. Next is the importance of MVP. And this is kind of this is when you start making the tough decisions. What's going to go out in that first release? So just a few keys to understand, when trying to define what your MVP is. 5 solid features are better than 10 buggy ones. There is no V2 without a V1. time to market is important, and must-haves are MVP, nice-to-haves are not. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this illustration. This is probably the best illustration that I've come across, so props to the references down below. But again, I've talked about MVP a lot during my career and read a lot about it, but I think this illustration really sums it up the best. The left pyramid here is what is not MVP, and that's lots of features done poorly. That's just focusing on lots of features without worrying about if it's pleasurable, convenient, usable. What truly is MVP is shown on the right pyramid there in that yellowish orange section, and these are core features done well. So this is what I would preach when discussing MVP is making sure that you are doing your core features well, and that doesn't mean everything. That is determining what is a must-have versus what is a nice-to-have. So with that being said, I want to turn it back over to Brian, and we're going to talk about the solutions that align with your goals.
Well, thank you, Josh. Now that we have a better understanding of the problems that we're trying to solve, we can start defining and planning out the details around those to develop the right solutions for our customers. So what are some strategies that you can take to start off that planning in the right way? Well, we've already talked about one, which was starting off with your goal. But that's just the beginning. From there, you need to work your way out from that goal and develop those features, as we talked about, not the other way around. And then once you've determined what those goals and those strategies to accomplish those goals are, prioritize those. We'll be delving into each of these a little bit deeper here in a couple of minutes. And then lastly, this is extremely important, remove the waste and stay lean. And what we mean by that is waste are just things that you don't necessarily need. So, for instance, wasted work, a very complex workflow when a simple workflow will do. All this really ties back to that initial concept of MVP that Josh was talking about a few minutes ago, where he was taking a narrow slice down through the list of all the different possible features. So start removing that waste. Determine kind of what are those key things that you need to focus on. We found there's a lot of different strategies out there to be able to do that. There's mind mapping. There's a lot of other tools. One we found that works rather well to help drive out those features and make sure they're tying back to goals is impact mapping. There's a great book which we can share the link for that describes the concept of impact mapping in more detail. But from a very high level, we're going to go ahead and cover it here. What's key is that it starts with a goal. And once you define that goal, then you branch out from there and you look at who are the actors. The actors in this case, many times may be those personas that Josh was talking about. And then from there, you need to determine the impacts that you want to have on those actors. For instance, what behaviors do you want to change? What behaviors do you want to influence? And then the very last thing that you do is determine what those deliverables are. They could be features, they could be processes, a lot of different things. For the sake of the discussion, though, let's take a check-in process where you're trying to decrease the patient wait times by 25%. And so if we look at that goal, we want to decrease wait times. There's a lot of different ways for us to do that. So we start off with our goal and we look at who are the actors. They're doctors, nurses, patients, maybe some others on the hospital staff. And then let's pick out a key impact, which is we want to decrease the amount of paperwork. There could be some others too. For instance, maybe allowing them to submit things beforehand. But let's just try to decrease the paperwork overall. So from there, you can look at it from the perspective of what are the deliverables that accomplish that goal and influence that behavior. Maybe a telehealth solution. So instead of even coming into the doctor, that's something that they can now do online. If they do come in, provide them that opportunity to do an online check-in. And then from there, move even further where you can define even other features such as maybe even paging so that you're notifying them when the physician's ready to see them. And so kind of following that method, You can make sure that your goals are then extending out to your solutions rather than your solutions driving your goal. So now that we've talked about a couple of different aspects of defining those goals, and we've talked about this concept of impact mapping and defining your features, what do you do with those features? Well, you got to get to the details at some point. Even in agile methodologies, requirements are still alive. And that's one thing to remember, is that if your team doesn't have a good understanding of what you're trying to accomplish, then it's very hard for them to be able to build those solutions. You may have two teams that are highly efficient and work well together. They're all in the same room together. And maybe in that case, you may not need as many requirements as in situations where they're scattered all around the country. But it's always important that you need to have somewhere to start. And we found a couple of different tools that really help us to identify what are those requirements, and then how do we manage those requirements. A couple that we'll talk about here in a minute. One is story mapping. The other is user stories, and then backlog. So I think it's important first to talk about what a user story is. So you've probably heard us mention this before, or you definitely will through the rest of the presentation. But a user story is really just a tool to help you identify the requirements for the user. And they're a little bit different than your classic requirements. They focus on the user rather than the activity that the user's going through. They also define the acceptance criteria, and they're really that start of that conversation between you and the rest of the team as far as what the solutions are. You'll notice here in the example that we have, there's nothing in here on the screen that's really saying what the solution is. Normally a user story is structured in a way where it starts off with as a user, so those personas that Josh mentioned earlier. I want to accomplish a specific goal so that I can reach this particular reason. Now, I'll throw out a good example since it's been so hot lately. As a hungry user, I want to be able to order ice cream online so I don't have to go out in 100-degree heat when I'm hungry. So that's an example of a user story. And that's just the start. So as you're defining these, you need to really take the app maps that, for instance, Josh described earlier, the journey maps, the impact maps, and take those and then drive it a little bit further down. So since we're talking about ice cream, let's talk about how we can drill down to those specific user stories and how we can define what is part of that. So I wanted to kind of talk through this concept of user story mapping. And user story mapping is just an extremely simple approach where you're talking through the journey that the user is going through within your product so that you can help drive out the specific requirements related to those particular features. So in this particular example here, I'll kind of walk through this. We've got ordering ice cream, and there's a couple of key things we know we want to do with ordering ice cream. We've got finding a flavor, picking a size, ordering a certain amount, and placing an order. And so if you were thinking about that from a user story perspective, what are those things that you can do underneath that? Well, with finding a flavor, maybe you want to browse flavors, you want to have basic search, and maybe you want an advanced search where you're looking for some specialty flavors. Or when you're picking size, you want small, medium, large, so forth. And then maybe long term, you might even want that ability so when somebody submits an order, you save that information so when they come back, they can do that quickly. So this is an example of a story map. So I start off by finding a flavor, I pick one, I order it, and then I place the order. And across this, you'll notice I've got a couple of things where I've broken these out. And where user story mapping is extremely helpful is as you're walking through this, you can use it to start that prioritization conversation. So you're looking at things maybe from an MVP perspective. You know that little thin slice is all about getting the ice cream. And you just want some ice cream. You don't care what ice cream. So maybe it's you browse a flavor, you just got one size, and you can pay online. But over time, you may want to add additional features. So that's that's an example of an MVP and how it might apply to to the fact that I'm hungry and really want to get some ice cream this afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead and move on just a little bit further, and now that we've talked about user story mapping, how does it really help? Well, hopefully you've seen how it helps define the requirements, but it also shows the big picture. It starts at that exercise that we've talked about as far as prioritization, but one of the other key things is it helps us identify dependencies. If you're just throwing features out there, you may not even realize that certain ones need to happen before others. And once you start mapping that out, it helps you understand that maybe those are lower priority even though they seemed higher because these other things need to happen first. So we've defined our user stories. What do we do with them? Well, we have to have a way of managing those and consolidating those for the team. And generally what we do is we consolidate all of that into a backlog. And a backlog is simply a list of user stories or a list of things that the team is going to be working against. And ensuring that backlog is ready for the team to start working against is what's key. So when we're looking at backlogs, there's a couple of things that we really want to be able to do. And the number one thing is prioritize the backlog. So when we're developing this entire list that the team's going to be working against over the course of developing a product, we want to go through and make sure that those stories are in prioritized order, but at the same time, we want to groom out those stories. And what we mean by grooming is we want to get to the details. We may not get to the details of all of them, but we want to start taking those stories and drill a little bit deeper. What's involved in this? Do we really understand what's going to be needed? Do we really understand what the requirements are? Is this story way too big? Is it something that we can break down further, prioritize, make even leaner? And then also we want to evaluate all these back to our original goals, make sure that they still fit. And one of the other things that a backlog provides you is that ability to be able to go back and clean up things and make sure that you're reducing that waste and that whatever is in the backlog is something that's valuable to the team as they start developing the product. So we seem to be talking a lot about user stories, a lot about backlogs. So you're probably wondering, when are we going to start planning? Well, we already have. These are all inputs into the plan, and they really provide us valuable information, which planning would almost be useless without this additional information. We would just be throwing things on a wall and coming up with a schedule not based on specific requirements or customer needs. Now, that being said, there are some key activities that are involved on Agile projects that specifically focus on planning. A couple of those are release planning. So a release plan, think of it as basically your high-level roadmap, where you're focusing in on what features do we want it to deliver during this particular release. And these are very high-level things, so you may have particular themes. We'll go back to ice cream. Maybe we just want people to browse the ice cream and come into our store and eat it versus ordering it online. Well, that could be a release 1. Release 2 is adding that ability to be able to order online. So we're defining that overall release and that roadmap. That's one of the first types of planning. And then another type is sprint planning, where you're each and every sprint, you're starting off, you're going back, you're reviewing what stories you have in the backlog, which ones are the highest priority, what is the team going to focus on during the sprint. And when I say a sprint, but really what I'm talking about is a fixed period of time. So for instance, a sprint could be 2 weeks, could be 4 weeks, but it's basically a mini project with a fixed period of time. So as you're working on each sprint, that's not just a one time and you're done type of activity. All of these are continuous. That over time, you're doing release planning, you're doing sprint planning, you're prioritizing the backlog, which is a form of planning, and then you're also estimating. We're not going to spend too much time talking about estimation here. It's more of an art many times than a science when you're looking at things that are very high level. So, there's a lot of factors that go into it. such as, how much you know about the particular the market that you're trying to impact, how much do you know about your users, is this an existing product or not. There's a lot that can go into estimation. So we won't really cover that today, but that is part of the planning process, because as you go into each sprint, you need to have a good understanding, or at least a high-level understanding of what your team can accomplish during a sprint, rather than trying to force stories into a sprint and say, here's what you're going to be working on during a sprint. It's better to allow the team to drive that, and that's really where estimation comes into play. So now that we've talked about planning, let's take it a step further, and let's kind of review where we've been. We've talked about how to define SMART goals. How do we better understand our customer's journey? We tied all of that back to how do we take that journey and then develop solutions that are meeting those specific needs. And then lastly, how do we take all these inputs and truly start developing a plan that we can execute against? So as we look at all of these, what comes next? What do we do with all this information? What do we do with all of these tools that we've put in place? We've developed all these artifacts. How do we take the next step? Well, the key thing is, if you don't start, you'll never finish. So as you look at your projects and you take some of these approaches and you start moving forward with them, consider a couple of different options to move forward. Don't try to change the entire company all at once. Start small. Take maybe a small project. Try to apply some of these approaches and try them out. Start over. The key thing is, this is an iterative process. You will fail, and the important thing is to learn from that failure and then apply those lessons learned so that they don't happen again. And then the other thing is to start now. Take maybe just one piece of this and go ahead and start utilizing it. See if it works within your organization. There's a lot of other solutions and tools that are available too. These are just some that we've found that work really well for us. There may be others that work well for you. But try to integrate these in and see if they start having an impact on your project. I know we've touched on a lot of information today, but hopefully what we've talked about will really be some things that you can apply on your projects and hopefully reduce the risk of failure, so that you're not one of that 70% or that 15% or that 40% that are out there, the projects that fail. So again, I'd really like to thank you for your time. I know that we have some extra time here available for questions, so I'm going to turn things back over to Kevin. Kevin?
Great, thank you guys. That was awesome. Yeah, we do have a handful of questions here. So the first one is, who from my team would need to be involved in this type of effort?
And Kevin, I can take that one. I think what's key is to make sure that you've got a cross-functional team. If you just have a specific group, it makes some of these conversations pretty difficult. So for instance, if you have a marketing team that might have information about your customers, you may have a development team that understands kind of the current state of the application. You may have actual end users that may be able to take part in these conversations. The more groups that you can have involved, or the more representation of those groups, the better. Of course, there is a law of diminishing return there, where you can have too many people involved. But the key thing is not just focus in on one person. The more variety that you can have, the better.
Got it. Okay. And we've actually got a kind of related question, kind of tied to that first question. What are the roles and responsibilities of senior executives that hold the purse strings?
So those are definitely the stakeholders, and those are extremely important. And that's really why you really want to start off with a good goal in mind. So those individuals are key. So in fact, many times they're driving those goals. And so during that initial activity where doing something such as impact mapping, or really just trying to define those overall business goals, that's where it's definitely key to have those individuals involved.
Makes sense. Okay. So I've got another question here. How do I sell the idea of an MVP to my upper management?
Good question. So one of my mentors used to, tell our customers, I can give you a little bit now or everything never. So if you think back to those illustrations that I showed on MVP, if you really concentrate on those core features and you do them right, you're going to earn the trust of your customers. And what you're going to get from that, from your customers is, this is fantastic, give me more. Instead of, well, fix this, fix that, and fix this. So once you earn the trust of your customers, they're going to come back for more. That's how I would sell that to upper management.
Okay. Thank you. I've got one more here. Do we have to follow an agile methodology to get value out of these UX tools that you guys have mentioned?
So I'm assuming we're talking about, the persona exercise and the app map exercise and journey mapping. I would say no. Whether you're using Agile or Waterfall or some kind of hybrid, it's always a good idea to, understand who your users are, map out the journey so you can, understand the feelings and the behaviors of your users. And still, even though you might be doing Waterfall, to map out the screens that you will be designing and developing.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, it looks like that is all of the questions. Again, thank you, Brian and Josh. I think this presentation has been super informative and helpful, hopefully. And also, thank you to all of our listeners for joining in this afternoon. As a reminder, again, we'll be sharing a recording of today's webinar via email in the next day or so. And as always, if you'd like to learn more about PointClear Solutions, you can find us on the web at www.pointclearsolutions.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.